11 million people stay in their homes, 6 million families to be secure in housing, where those children will be able to start school in the next few weeks and not have to worry about where they're going to sleep.
Welcome to The Real News. I'm Jessel Noor. Millions of renters were able to breathe a collective sigh of relief on August 3rd when President Joe Biden extended the eviction moratorium. Some 7 million Americans are behind on rent and had faced possible eviction in the coming weeks in the midst of a surge of COVID-19 infections. The move was a win for progressives like Missouri Rep. Cori Bush, who herself had experienced homelessness in the past and held a vigil on the steps of the Capitol night and day to demand Democrats take action. But the eviction and housing crisis are far from over. The moratorium is not a ban on evictions, and they have continued throughout the pandemic. And many fear the 60-day extension will just delay evictions and not stop them altogether. Now joining me to discuss this are three guests, all in Baltimore, a city with one of the highest eviction rates in the country. Cherise Liu is an attorney with the Public Justice Center's Human Right to Housing Project. Detrice Dowridge is the president of the Right to Housing Alliance in Baltimore. And Caitlin Goldblatt is an organizer with Baltimore's Renters United. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I wanted to, we really appreciate it because I know now is a really pivotal time in this, in the country, and with the rise of COVID and this threat of evictions, at least momentarily, temporarily, pushed down the road. But I wanted to start with the opponents of this eviction moratorium, who say it will devastate mom and pop housing providers everywhere. They've already filed multiple lawsuits in localities and, on a federal level. And they say, there was never legal authority for the Center for Disease Control to issue a nationwide eviction moratorium, even though we're in the midst of a global pandemic, which is surging in many states around the country. Caitlin, let's start with you.
Well, first of all, I think we need to immediately dispense with the notion of mom and pop landlords. Certainly, there are individuals who rent out a room in their home or who own one other property that they rent out. But the idea of these being mom and pop landlords, when in fact these are people who own, at minimum, multiple properties, is a way of really diminishing, at least rhetorically, the violence of eviction and ultimately the power that landlords really have over tenants. In Maryland, for example, many landlords who I believe would be considered quote unquote mom and pop landlords happen to be part of a major lobbying group, the Maryland Multifamily Housing Association, that wields immense control over our state legislature and over our city legislatures as well. And this is a ton of capital that amasses within cities and within states and has far more influence than organizations like the ones we're a part of ultimately do. So they also have connections with much larger businesses and also property management companies that are partly responsible for a lot of abuses that happen to tenants. And I really think that it's disingenuous at best to refer to those groups of folks as mom and pop landlords. Moreover, I feel like we always have to look at who has the least power in these situations, which are, of course, tenants. And many tenants are at risk of being made homeless at this point, and that's not to mention even the apparent inability of state, local, and of course the federal government to really do something about permanently and affordably housing people currently experiencing homelessness.
Cherise, before we started the interview, we were talking about just the massive scale of evictions that have existed in Baltimore, for example, for years. And if you look at a map of where these evictions are taking place, it really tells a lot. It's a lot of, I mean, it's the black butterfly, like Dr. Lawrence Brown would say. It's black working class neighborhoods that have faced decades and centuries of racist policies like redlining, been denied an access to wealth, and so are forced to be renters, and often are forced to deal with slumlords who rent out properties that are substandard. And so the Public Justice Center has been tracking the number of evictions that have been going on despite the moratorium. So a lot of people don't understand that evictions have been continuing during the pandemic. Can you give us that information and what that looks like?
Yeah, so about 130,000 households in Maryland are at risk of eviction right now. That's countless amount of individuals, families, children, elderly, the disabled, veterans. 78% of these people are persons of color, BIPOC, who and that holds true, right? That all that you mentioned, redlining, lower income, segregated neighborhoods. But what also holds true with these were the people on the front lines. They were our essential workers. So many of them grew ill during the pandemic, now have permanent disabilities, permanent health issues. Many families lost the main income, the person who had the main income who was working during COVID. And so that's a big hit to the family. Many of them have funeral costs. Many of them now have child care costs that they did not have before. And many of them have even returned to work, but need more time to pay the debt. Right? So that money, those ERAP funds need to be pushed out. As of right now in Baltimore City, $0 of the ERAP funds have been pushed out.
$0.
$0 of the ERAP funds have been pushed out, while this many people are at risk of eviction, right? Evictions continued during all of 2020 and now in 2021. As a matter of fact, lifting the moratoriums, we had a brief time where the moratoriums were lifted, and over 400,000 excess cases in 2020 due to those moratoriums being lifted, and over 10,000, almost 11,000 deaths up to September 3rd of 2020, not even after that, due to the lifting of the moratoriums, directly linked to housing. Housing is a public health issue. It has always been a public health issue. And right now, not only do these individuals and families can't afford to be put onto the street, but our infrastructure cannot afford to be put on the street. Our public health cannot afford for these families to lose their homes.
Detrice, so you're the president of the Right to Housing Alliance, which is led by low-income residents in the city, which, as we know, are the ones that are on the front line of this crisis. And it seems like every crisis that this country faces. We saw Cori Bush, and which is also incredible because she was formerly experienced homelessness herself. And Congress is mostly made up of millionaires. That this reality of being housing insecure is completely foreign to them. So many of them went out on vacation. They said that they couldn't do anything. Joe Biden said he couldn't do anything. And you had Cori Bush and dozens of people holding vigil on the Capitol, and that, just basically shaming these leaders that we've elected to take action. They finally did that. Can you talk about a little bit about this movement and what it means today? And of course that, this eviction moratorium, is not enough. It's going to expire in 60 days. And, it's still not stopping all evictions. What that means for people in cities like Baltimore.
I think if the leaders of city of Maryland and all around the world took this issue seriously and really looked into this, it would make a better change for renters all around. What we find is that this issue is not really taken seriously. For example, I've dealt with people who have slumlords. Slumlords intentionally take advantage of renters and shame them for being low income, have them living in deplorable conditions, and find that landlords sometimes often retaliate against people who decide to form tenant unions, stand up for their self and their rights and their neighbors' rights. Um, we, what I thought, had laws to protect tenants here in Maryland, but when tenants try to voice those protections in court, they're often shut down by judges, and it's always seemed like it's favorable towards the landlord, even when the landlord is clearly in the wrong. So we really too want to push with starting with having change in the rent court system as well, and start from there, and to just build a bigger movement for fair rights for tenants all around.
And I think it's something like 90% of cases that go in front of this eviction court, the judge will rule on the side of the landlord. And I know Baltimore just became one of the few cities to pass a right to counsel, which is significant legislation, because it's really rare for tenants to have access to an attorney. There's no guaranteed right to that. That will change, but that's not going to happen until October. Can you talk a little bit about what impact that could have? And I know, Cori Bush also introduced, a Bill of Rights for renters as well in Congress. And of course, that's going to be an uphill battle. But what other, practical steps can cities take? Because, cities like Baltimore are facing violence. But evictions, you kick people out in the street. You look at it from any level. It doesn't make community safer from a public health standpoint, from a violence standpoint. You're trying to build stronger cities, and you can't be evicting thousands of people and giving them nowhere to go. I'll just open this up.
So about 90% plus landlords are represented in court, while 1% of tenants are represented in our courts. I would urge that cities and states are all around pass a right to counsel. Now here in Baltimore, we need to fund it, right? We have passed the right to counsel, but it's time to fund it. 10% of those ERAP funds can go towards right to counsel. Counsel is going to be needed because everyone assumes that landlords are going to say the exact amount, if at all, that is owed. You mentioned mom and pop landlords. This government has set aside $46 billion. I'll say it again, $46 billion is out there for one industry. And the reason for that is not because they are special, but because lives are at stake. Children's lives, our lives, the well-being of families and individuals are at stake. But we need the cities and municipalities need time to push that money out. It is time for them to push that money out, but lawyers will be there as a regulatory mechanism. Not all of I see it every day. Landlords claim this is owed, that is not owed. Landlords who are not legally entitled to funds. Landlords who are abusive, landlords whose properties are uninhabitable. And when we say low-income tenants, let's be clear on this. They're not paying low-income rent. On average, I see $1,100, $1,200 for rent in Baltimore. Many homes don't have running water and heat. Mm-hmm. So things need to be done, put in place, like eviction diversion programs. We need more time. Eviction should not be the first step whenever there's an issue between a landlord and tenant. And that's what I would recommend to our city, to our state, and to other states and municipality. This is what is needed. We need to stabilize housing. This is a fundamental human right.
I would also add that per what Sharice was saying in terms of landlords being represented almost all the time, landlords in Baltimore City Rent Court are empowered to represent themselves, be represented by an agent who is not a lawyer, or be represented by a lawyer, whereas tenants are only empowered to represent themselves or have a lawyer. They don't have this less expensive mechanism offered to them where they could just have someone they know come up and represent their interest or act as a witness necessarily. So tenant right to counsel is more important than ever. And the fact that this hasn't been fully funded yet is confusing given the dire straits that we've been in for a year and a half at this point, especially. Also, when it comes to rent court, there are many reforms that could be undertaken. As Charisse mentioned, there are many landlords who are not legally entitled to be collecting rent at all, who do not have rental licenses that are active, partly because many landlords do offer substandard living conditions to tenants which do not pass inspections. And sometimes when you're in rent court, it's entirely up to the judge who's presiding whether or not that is actually recognized as a defense, or whether or not poor conditions are actually recognized as a defense. And so really it is only oftentimes a pro bono attorney who can stand between all of these mechanisms that are stacked against tenants in order to keep them from being evicted when there may have been absolutely no cause to evict, legally speaking. Also, I mean, right to counsel itself is effective. 92% of represented tenants would avoid disruptive displacement with right to counsel in Baltimore City, which is really similar to stats from other jurisdictions with right to counsel like New York and San Francisco. Federal funds really shouldn't be serving as a landlord bailout, and right to counsel ensures that landlords don't just take rental assistance and still try to evict. So all of this can work together to protect tenants and keep them housed.
And, I've been talking to renters facing eviction in Maryland, and initially, and so for example, Mary, let's say Mary, I was talking to Mary yesterday, and she, lost her job during the pandemic, started working in June, but is 3 months behind rent. And it's going to take a long time to save up that money. She doesn't have savings. She's working full time, but just being able to come up with $3,000 or $4,000 is, if you don't have savings, that's really hard to do. And so, and with this moratorium, it's just delaying it by 60 days. Do you have advice right now for tenants that are, and maybe are even unsure if they're covered by the eviction moratorium, like Baltimore County, for example? I was just talking to a tenant who's unsure if the moratorium will extend to her. Charisse, maybe can you shed some light on that, and if there's some good resources that people can use to
Yes,
find out?
yes, and it is confusing. That is another thing why right to counsel is necessary. Even at these times between the moratoria and all these different programs, tenants are confused, rightfully so. Some people didn't even receive unemployment at this time. They're still fighting for that. They are in need of legal service providers. So I would recommend that they contact legal service providers, HPRP, Public Justice Center, Legal Aid, to provide information about whether or not they are under this extended CDC moratorium in their jurisdiction, right? So that's number one. Number two, they should apply for the CAP funds. Maria, I believe is what you said her name was. She is a perfect candidate for those CAP funds. However, they are still in need of counsel because many of the landlords are taking those CAP funds and still evicting people. They're using the loopholes, the tenant holding overs, the breach of leases to still evict tenants. I don't know for what outcome, because everyone is having problems right now. So what tenant they are to fill that income, I don't know. But we see that every day. Landlords are now using loopholes to still evict after taking the CAP funds, after taking the rental assistance funds. So I do recommend that tenants, if you are afraid, if you have questions, reach out. We are there to answer your questions and assist. Also to Baltimore Renters United, reach out in Baltimore. We will help you.
And finally, Detrice, let's end with you. I mean, it seems like a lot of people are just becoming aware of this crisis now because it's been in the headlines, because Cori Bush has been in front of the Capitol. Talk a little bit about what people should know, because this just didn't start this week. It's been going on for a long time, and it's just going to continue. What people should know and how people can get involved if they want to support the work that groups like yours is doing.
Well, yeah. So I was actually a tenant. I'm a renter, but I was the place where I was living at the time. We were going through issues which resulted in a class action lawsuit. I actually came into Right to Housing Alliance because someone from this organization reached out to me, and once I started going to the meetings and learning more about things that's out there, resources to help you with tenants' rights, I became involved. And after the lawsuit, I decided to stay on to help other people and just pass that knowledge along to let people know you're not the only one going through what I went through. Um, and I would say for tenants, just reach out to, there's groups out there to help, even if you, because we're all about to just passing the knowledge along. And even if you want to do a tenants union, get together and form a tenants union, you can do that. We find that when tenants do that, landlords is quick to retaliate against you for doing that. But fortunately, there are retaliation laws to prevent that. That depends on what judge and court would want to enforce that. We've dealt with tenants who really didn't know about escrow and were even scared to go to court out of fear of retaliation, but just really teaching them how to stand up for themselves and just teaching them to say, like, I don't care if you pay $1 in rent, you still don't deserve to be treated as if you're a no one. You still deserve to live in safe and habitable housing. And yeah, so just like people like me who've been through it and just want to pass the knowledge along and just want to help other people feel safe and comfortable in their own home. So that's what we're about. And just we urge more tenants, especially rented, like to get involved because you're not the only one going through this.
Great. Well, we're going to leave this conversation here, but I want to thank you all for joining us. And we'll link to all your organizations, and you've all put out some great reports and resources for folks. We'll make sure to link to that on our website. But I want to thank you all for joining us and talking about this very important issue.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for having us.
Thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.